Hi there, welcome back to Hydroponics Daily with me, Dr. Russell Sharp. Today, I'm going to go through a checklist of all the items I think you need for your first grow, when you're starting out, when you're a beginner at hydroponics. And then I'm going to go through tomorrow what I would do, the techniques I would use, and some tips and advice for first-time growers. So I've got a list here, and I've got essential items, I've got desirable items, and then I've got things that are probably just too much and would be overcomplicating it and would just lead to issues in your first grow. Your first grow, you want to get through to harvest and not be experimenting. You want to be developing that baseline that you know how to grow something adequately so that you can then start tweaking things later. You don't want to be tweaking things in your first grow. It's a recipe for disaster. Okay? So the first thing is not an item. The first thing is a time of year. And I would say that if you're going to grow indoors, the first thing you need is winter. It's very difficult to grow indoors hydroponically during the summer because the high temperatures really interfere with the ability to get a really good grow first time round. So if you're going to grow hydroponically, probably best doing it in the winter. I am now saying that in April. So unless you're in the southern hemisphere, that's useless advice. But just bear that in mind. The first item you're going to need is a grow tent. Now, you can grow without a grow tent, but it means you're going to have a lot of issues with controlling the environment, controlling pest and disease, and also the humidity could affect your house. If you were grown in, say, the southern states of the United States, having a humidifier running in a house that is already predisposed to termites, for example, or in the UK, mold, would be foolhardy. I would want it to be a rental property if I was growing without a grow tent in the UK and using a humidifier. So grow tent, good for so many reasons. It just helps you dial in that environment and protect against pest and disease. Used to be that you weren't advised to get an LED light. On your first grow, you would use a cheap and cheerful sodium lamp. However, the price of LED lights have gone down dramatically recently. So I would get a low-powered LED light. I wouldn't go for something that's really high, like a 720 watt light. I'd go for something a bit lower so that you're not overpowering the environment. Yep, you won't get massive photosynthesis rates, but you will be able to just control that humidity without the need for complicated equipment and the temperature and things like that. The next item is an outlet fan. You are going to need an outlet fan just to get that heat from the light out of your grow room. And if you're growing a crop that produces lots of odors and you don't want the odors going out, then you would need a carbon filter. It has to be a carbon filter because that's what takes the odors out. It can't just be a fabric filter. So you're going to need that. You're going to need a circulatory fan to move the leaves to, as we talked about if it was either yesterday or the day before, circulate that airflow. You're not just going to rely on the outlet fan for that. Okay, then you're going to need pots and saucers. Pots because you need something for the growing media the plants to go into, and saucers to collect the runoff. And runoff's important. It's an often neglected thing. You're going to need to flush the fertigation solution through that. And then I would go for cocoa as a growing medium. My colleague Matthew says soil, but that's not strictly speaking hydroponics. Hydroponics is without soil. So this is a hydroponic grow. So cocoa, it's a very forgiving hydroponic medium. You're not going to get algal buildup. And so I would go for cocoa. Obviously, there's no nutrients held in the cocoa. Next up, you're going to need a nutrient. And if this is a simple, basic hydroponic grow, then I recommend our fertilizer, Gold Leaf, or as it's called in the UK, Liquid Gold. Yes, you can produce fantastic yields. Yes, it's used by professional growers, but it's also really good for beginners because you don't need to worry about pH manipulation. You don't need to worry about dechlorination. You don't need an A and a B and mixing that. It's non-hazardous, so you can put it in a domestic situation. You don't need hazardous pH up and down and all the issues that go with accurately dosing pH up and down. So I would consider Gold Leaf or Liquid Gold essential. Then you're going to need some scissors for harvesting your crop or for defoliation. Now, you could use secateurs. They would be under the desirable, or snippers. They could be under desirable. Some kitchen scissors will do an adequate job. Not the perfect job, but an adequate job. You're going to need some seeds, and I would spend a lot of time researching the exact variety you want. So if you're growing crops in America that are legal, then you need to do a lot of research, and research places like Reddit would be really good for like getting recommendations on good sources for seeds, because there's a lot of hype in that area. But even things like basil, you might think, oh, I'm going to grow hydroponics and go basil. Choosing the right variety of basil is crucial in hydroponics, because it can go terribly wrong if you use the wrong one. And there's lots of research around photoperiod and stuff we'll talk about tomorrow when it talks about advice for you. This is just the items you need for your first one. You're going to need an inlet filter. So for that, you would want a bit of ducting with just some cut up tights over the end. And that's going to be what's allowing the air to flow into your grow room. Lots of grow rooms have mesh vents, and that could just be your inlet filter in there already. You're going to need a watering can to irrigate, or if you've got a hose with a shower nozzle on. And then, controversially, I think you want to have an EC pen. And that comes back to that. My number one tip on all of this is make sure you flush 20% of your fertigation solution at least out into the saucers, and then either suck that up or pour that away into the garden. Don't pour it down the drain, because that's going to be pollution. And then measure the electrical conductivity of that outflow, because you don't want the salts building up and the fertilizer building up and becoming toxic to the plant. So that's what I think. I think you don't want a tent that's smaller than 1 meter by 1 meter. What's that? 3 foot by 3 foot, and then 2 meters. So 3.5 foot, I think, isn't it? 1 meter, and then 2 meters tall or 2.2 meters tall. Anything smaller than that, and you really struggle to control the temperature and the humidity, and it would be it's going to be a lot more work to have a smaller tent. In the essentials items, a pH meter would be classed as essential if you weren't using gold leaf, or it's called in the UK liquid gold, because if you're not using that product, then you also need to use A and B and CalMags and pH ups and pH down. So a pH meter becomes essential if you're not using that product. Okay, so they are the essential items. You can get away with that, all those items, and some patience, lots of enthusiasm, and you can get your first hydroponic grow. Now, there are desirable items that you could also include, and I would say an inlet fan would be a desirable item, because then your grow tent's not getting sucked in on itself by the outlet fan, and it just allows both fans to work in harmony without overstretching the filter. And so that would be a good option to buy. You could buy exactly the same fan as your outlet fan. I would always recommend purchasing a hand lens, because you can look for trichomes, you can study your plants, you can look for pests and disease much earlier, and therefore control them a lot earlier, which is a lot easier. I would recommend a desirable item would be a max min thermometer and a hygrometer for measuring the humidity. You could have a data logger that would automatically sense this, and you can download the information to your phone, so you can constantly look at the current temperature and humidity in your grow room. However, that is very much a desirable, not an essential. And you could just have a thermometer that told you what was the maximum minimum for the last 24 hours. As I say, a pH meter, if you're using gold leaf, then a pH meter is desirable. If you're using a standard hydroponic fertilizer from the designed in the 1970s, then, which is basically everything else, then that would be essential. You're going to need desirable would be a propagation tent and a propagation light, so that you can have different veg or cuttings and seedlings to your flowering tent and things like this. But that's very much desirable and almost into too much for your first grow. Secateurs would be desirable as opposed to scissors, getting a much cleaner cut. I like those really small snippers you can buy that you use and they spring back. They're really good for defoliation. You could look at purchasing cuttings rather than propagating from seed, and you could get a good strain of and protect get some fancy genetics and things like this. However, that's very much more on the desirable than the essential. Seeds are the essential one. Cuttings, a bit of an overcomplication, because you need to know how to transplant them, and you need to make sure you're aware of the signs of pest and disease when purchasing them, which you may not be. Okay. Desirable would be sticky traps for catching pests. I've nearly put that on the essentials list, though. Sticky traps for catching fungus gnats, for catching aphids, for catching thrips are very much almost on the essential. And then dehumidifiers and humidifiers. If you've got a hygrometer for measuring the humidity and you really want to dial that humidity in, then you can purchase a dehumidifier or a humidifier, to put water into the environment or take water out. However, these are very much desirable. They're not essential for your first grow, but they are very good at making sure that your plants are in the optimum health. So if you want to really maximize yield. And then the things that I think are just too much for your first grow, CO2 enrichment. That's too much for your first grow because, yes, it will super boost growth, but it will only super boost growth if all your other factors, all your other variables are dialed in at their optimum. It's no good if your plants are in deficit of water, if they've got too much fertilizer, if the light levels aren't super high, if the air movement's not right. So it's an overcomplication to begin with. And also it's expensive and you need to do a lot of research to find out what is the best option for you. So you could spend a lot of money and waste a lot of money that could have been spent better elsewhere. I'd also say that boosters, terpene boosters, or the boost product, we sell a lot of products like humic acids, yucca extracts, seaweed extracts, all these things that can be used for various different things. But it's just too much for your first grow. And if you added them and your grow failed, you wouldn't know what the reason was for that failing, or if you had a really good yield, you wouldn't know what it was. So you stack these things up or experiment and there you go from there. Same for UV lamps. UV lamps are expensive if you choose a really good one. There's a lot of research to do into UV lamps. So do you go for UVC, UVA, UVB? If you're going for UVC, there's a lot of safety concerns around UV lamps. When it comes to you could harm yourself, your eyes particularly. There's a cancer risk with UVC. And yes, you can control pest and disease. Yes, you can increase secondary metabolites like terpenes, but you could also kill your plant off with UV light very easily. On the too much list, I've also included nutrient film technique or NFT, deep water culture, DWC, ebb and flood system, or any system that uses rock wool. They're all fantastic. They're all really good. They're the reason we get into hydroponics, because they're cool ways of growing. They involve pumps. They involve water rushing around, no soil, no cocoa, but they are very complicated and very easy to get wrong on your first grow. So I would avoid it for your first grow. I do cocoa in standard plant pots. And I say too much, if you're using gold leaf or liquid gold, as it's called in the UK, if you don't be bothering with pH up and down, because you don't need it, and it's going to be hazardous. And you can mess around with pH up and down if you're using standard fertilizer, but you don't need it for that one. I'd also avoid silicon. Silicon can go wrong very easily. You need to know what you're doing, seek advice. Silicon can produce very good, healthy crops with really good cell strength, but it's also really easy to get wrong especially the EC tends to drag up over time as well with using silicon. And there's lots of products on the market. There's lots of claims. And so just avoid it for your first grow. You don't need it. So there's a big long list. Hopefully not chat GPT, but the AI, whatever the podcasting software we use, hopefully the AI will summarize that into a big long bullet point list. If not, I'll probably transcribe it myself. So until tomorrow, where I'll talk about what I would do in my first grow, that's been today's Hydroponics Daily. A big long checklist of all the things you need for your first grow, your first endeavor at growing plants hydroponically. Hopefully this has been of help, and you set up a grow in hydroponics very soon. Thank you very much.